Before you hear the story we're about to tell, you need to understand something. In Tennessee, there is a case so mishandled, so warped by pressure and politics, that the truth wasn't just distorted, it was buried. Here's what happened. A young woman disappears in broad daylight. A violent sexual predator who fit the eyewitness description is caught in lies and surrounded by red flags. But leadership at the highest levels of law enforcement orders that the focus on him be ended and new suspects located. The experienced career officers looking at the obvious suspect are shunned, cast out of the investigation, and eventually law enforcement altogether. And four local men, previously cleared, are suddenly recast as killers. When I first saw what was happening behind the scenes, I realized this wasn't just a tragedy of errors. It was incompetence, corruption, and cowardice, all wrapped up into one. This is the Holly Bobo case, the case that shattered a West Tennessee community and sent shockwaves across the nation. And nothing about it is what Tennesseans were told. Holly Bobo, a 20-year-old nursing student, abducted from her own driveway in broad daylight with no warning. Almost immediately, investigators honed in on a man who should have been impossible to ignore, Terry Britt, a serial, convicted, violent sex offender. He matched the eyewitness description. He was identified in a voice lineup. His alibi collapsed. And then came the search of his property. Burner phones, multiple hard drives containing violent sexual content, boots matching the description the eyewitness had given, and newspaper clippings of Holly and other young women Britt had been stalking. FBI-trained cadaver dogs alerted on tools in a locked shed and on two vans. When confronted with this evidence, Britt offered to plead guilty if he could get under 20 years and serve his sentence with older inmates. And then everything changed. Without explanation, investigators were reassigned. A new leadership team took over, and the orders came down. Stop pursuing Britt. The man who fit the profile, the description, the evidence, simply removed from the narrative, whisked away on separate kidnapping and weapons charges. That's when TBI Regional Special Agent in Charge Jack Van Hooser brought in a retired Memphis cop, Dennis Benjamin, who immediately began operating in the shadows. Before long, Dennis Benjamin had inserted himself into the Bobo family's world, offering help, comfort, guidance. Behind the scenes, he cultivated sources and helped redirect the case. And suddenly, four local men previously cleared were back on the board. Zach Adams, his brother Dylan, who had well-documented intellectual deficits, their friend Shane Austin, whose addiction to painkillers and benzos began after a high school shoulder surgery, and Jason Autry, older, with a long rap sheet, but like the others, no history of sexually predatory behavior.
Falsely accused, everybody. Innocent man, falsely accused.
Earlier investigators had checked their alibis and ruled them out, but those investigators had been pushed aside. Zach was arrested on unrelated charges, later dropped without explanation, and then charged with Holly's murder in March 2014 while already in custody. This murder charge was strange, considering that Holly's remains weren't found until September, 6 months later, in remote woods north of her home. While the new TBI team leaned into the rumor mill, Dylan was arrested on unrelated federal charges. As a condition of his plea deal, he was placed in the custody of a man he did not know, Dennis Benjamin. 5 weeks later, Benjamin reported to his buddies at TBI that Dylan had just confessed to the murder of Holly Bobo and implicated his brother Zach, their friend Shane, and Jason Autry. That confession didn't match physical evidence. It didn't match itself. It contained details that simply couldn't be true, and some the state seemingly didn't want to hear at all. Even prosecutors conceded it wasn't believable. You'd think a co-defendant's elaborate confession with grisly details would be a key piece of evidence in a trial. But that confession was never offered in court until years later by Zach Adams' lawyer to show just how ridiculous the confession and the case against him really was. But still, that confession became the foundation for accusing Zach, Dylan, Shane, and Jason Autry, until the narrative shifted again. Facing the death penalty and told that the public had already convicted him, Jason Autry flipped and became the state's star witness. This despite the fact there is no physical evidence linking Zach or anyone else to the crime, and cell phone data and eyewitness descriptions pointing toward a different assailant. The state incentivized other witnesses with threats of the death penalty or loss of custody of their children. And of course, the state had the ubiquitous jailhouse snitches and vulnerable community members whose stories changed only after the incentives arrived. Autry walked with time served. Shane Austin died by suicide 2 years before trial under the weight of addiction, depression, and growing suspicion. Dylan accepted an Alford plea and was sentenced to 35 years in prison. Zach Adams was convicted by a jury and sentenced to life without parole plus 50 years. Today, Zach is fighting for a new trial. His attorneys, Doug Bates and Crystal Etu, are arguing actual innocence, prosecutorial misconduct, and ineffective assistance of counsel at trial. A forensic neuropsychologist, Dr. Katie Spirko, joined the defense team. During her interview with Jason Autry at a federal holding facility, he recanted his testimony and laid out what he said was prosecutorial and law enforcement misconduct behind his perjured testimony. Dr. Spirko recorded that interview and, after verifying multiple details, released it to the media to expose what had gone wrong. The state was not pleased. And when she uncovered long-buried ATM security footage supporting Zach's alibi, their hostility intensified. Former prosecutor turned Judge Jennifer Nichols, disgraced former Memphis DA Amy Wyrick, and the TBI all directed pressure her way. That's where I entered the story, to protect Dr. Spirko from them. And that's how this podcast began. Now, with the final 2 days of Zach Adams' post-conviction relief hearing just weeks away, and with Terry Britt back in the very community he terrorized for decades, we're taking you inside one of the worst miscarriages of justice in Tennessee history. If you want to know how the most expensive investigation in Tennessee history went so catastrophically wrong, and what's being done now to fix it, you're in the right place. This is the Trial and Error Podcast with Dr. Katie Spirko and me, Dana McClendon.